Hi, this is Tammie with Empowered Beyond Belief, and I'm here to empower you. Today, I'll be narrating the book, Jesus, The Last Great Initiate by Edouard Schuré, translated by F. Rothwell, B.A. Published by Yogi Publication Society, Masonic Temple, Chicago, Illinois. Published in 1908. Please enjoy. The mission of the Christ. I came not to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. Matthew 5:17. The light was in the world, and the world was made by it, but the world knew it not. John 1:10. As the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Matthew 24:27. Preface. Criticism on the life of Jesus during the past century has been greatly to the fore. A complete account of this criticism will be found in the luminous sketch made by M. Sabatier, in which the entire history and present state of this investigation are given. Sufficient for the moment to refer to the two principal phases supplied by Strauss and Renan with the object of determining the new point of view I now wish to offer. Departing from the philosophical school of Hegel to ally himself with the critical and historical one of Bauer Strauss, without denying the existence of Jesus, the endeavor to prove that his life as related in the Gospels is a myth, a legend created by popular imagination to meet the necessities of a rising Christianity and in accordance with the Old Testament prophecy. His position, a purely negative one, but which he defended with great skill and erudition, has been found true in certain details, but quite untenable in its entirety and essential elements. It has, in addition, the grave defect of explaining neither the character of Jesus nor the origin of Christianity. The life of Jesus, according to Strauss, is a planetary system without a sun. One merit, however, must be granted in this work, that of having transferred the problem from the ground of dogmatic theology to that of textual and historical criticism. M. Renan's Vie de Jesus owes its brilliant success to its lofty aesthetic and literary qualities, as well as to the boldness of the writer, the first who dared make the life of Christ a problem of human psychology. Has he solved the problem? After the dazzling success of the book, the general opinion of all serious critics has been in the negative. The Jesus of M. Renan begins his career as a gentle dreamer, an enthusiastic but simple-minded moralist. He ends it as a violent thaumaturgist, devoid of all idea of reality. In spite of all the precautions of the historian, says M. Sabatier, it is the march of a healthy mind in the direction of madness. The Christ of M. Renan hovers between the calculations of ambition and the dreams of a seer. The fact is that he becomes the Messiah without wishing, almost without knowing it. He permits himself to be given this name merely to please the apostles and to fulfill the popular wish. It is not with so feeble a faith that a true prophet creates a new religion and changes the soul of the earth. The life of Jesus, according to M. Renan, is a planetary system illumined by a pallid sun devoid of vivifying magnetism or creative heat. How did Jesus become the Messiah? That is the primordial question, the solution of which is essential to the right understanding of the Christ. It is also that before which M. Renan hesitated and turned aside. M. Theodor Kein saw that this question must be boldly faced. Das Leben Jesu, Zurich, 1875, 3rd edition. His life of Jesus is the most remarkable that has appeared since M. Renan's. It throws on the question all light given by texts and history esoterically interpreted, but the problem is not one capable of being solved without the aid of intuition and esoteric tradition. It is by means of this esoteric light, the inner flame of all religions, the central truth of all fruitful philosophy, that I have attempted to reconstruct along its main lines the life of Jesus, taking into account whatever previous historical criticism has hitherto cleared and prepared the ground. No need to define what I mean by the esoteric point of view, the synthesis of religion and science. Concerning the historical and relative value of the Gospels, I have taken the three synoptical Gospels, those of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as a basis, and that of John as the arcanum of the esoteric teaching of the Christ, at the same time acknowledging the subsequent language and form, and the symbolical tendency of this gospel. All four gospels, which should be mutually examined and verified, are equally authentic, though from different claims. Those of Matthew and Mark are precious gospels of letter and fact. Therein are to be found the public deeds and words of the Christ. The gentle Luke affords a glimpse of the mystery meaning beneath the poetical legend veil. It is the gospel of the soul, of woman, and of love. St. John unfolds these mysteries. In his gospel are to be found the inner depths of the doctrine, the secret teaching, the meaning of the promise, the esoteric reserve. Clement of Alexandria, one of the few Christian bishops who held the key to universal esotericism, rightly named it the gospel of the Spirit. John has a profound insight of the transcendent truths revealed by the Master and a great facility in presenting them. Accordingly, his symbol is the eagle, whose wing cleaves the firmament and whose flaming eye encompasses the depths of space. End of preface. Chapter 1. Condition of the world at the birth of Jesus. A solemn period of the world's destiny was approaching. The sky was overshadowed with darkness and filled with sinister omens. In spite of the efforts of the initiates, polytheism throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe had terminated only in the downfall of civilization. The sublime cosmology of Orpheus, so gloriously chanted by Homer, had not been attained, and the only explanation possible is that human nature found great difficulty in maintaining a certain intellectual altitude. For the great spirits of antiquity, the gods were never anything more than a poetical expression of the subordinated forces of nature, a speaking image of its inner organism. It is as symbols of cosmic and animic forces that these gods live indestructible in the consciousness of humanity. This diversity of gods and forces, the initiates thought, was dominated and penetrated by the supreme God or pure spirit. The principal aim of sanctuaries of Memphis, Delphi, Eleusis had been precisely the teaching of this unity of God, with the theosophical ideas and moral discipline resulting therefrom. But the disciples of Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato failed before the egoism of the politicians, the sordidness of the sophists, and the passion of the mob. The social and political decomposition of Greece was the consequence of its religious, moral, and intellectual decomposition. Apollo, the solar word, the manifestation of the supreme God and the supra-terrestrial world, is silent. No more oracles, no more inspired poets are to be heard. Minerva, wisdom and foresight, veils her countenance in presence of her people converted into satyrs, profaning the mysteries and insulting the gods in Aristophanic farces on the stage of Bacchus. The very mysteries themselves are corrupted, for the sycophants and courtesans are admitted to the Eleusinian rites. When the soul becomes blunted, religion falls into idolatry. When the thought becomes materialized, philosophy degenerates into skepticism. Thus we see Lucian, poor microbe born from the corpse of paganism, turn the myths into ridicule, when once Carneades had denied their scientific origin. Superstitious in religion, agnostic in philosophy, egotistical and divided in politics, reeling under anarchy and fatally abandoned to despotism, Greece had become sadly changed from the time when she transmitted the science of Egypt and the mysteries of Asia in immortal forms of beauty. If there was one who understood what the world needed and who endeavored to restore this need by an effort of heroic genius, that one was Alexander the Great. This legendary conqueror initiated, as was also his father, Philip, into the mysteries of Samothrace, proved himself even more of an intellectual son of Orpheus than a disciple of Aristotle. Doubtless the Achilles of Macedonia, who, accompanied by a mere handful of Greeks, crossed Asia as far as India, dreamed of universal empire, but not after the fashion of Caesars, by oppression of the people, and the destruction of religion and unfettered science. His grand idea was to reconcile Asia and Europe by a synthesis of religions, supported by scientific authority. Impelled by this thought, he paid homage to the science of Aristotle. He did to Minerva of Athens, the Jehovah of Jerusalem, the Egyptian Osiris, and the Hindu Brahma, recognizing as would a veritable initiate an identical divinity and wisdom beneath these differing symbols. This new Dionysus possessed a broad sympathy and mighty prophetic insight. Alexander's sword typified the last flash of the grace of Orpheus, illumining both east and west. The son of Philip died in the intoxication of victory and the glorious accomplishment of his dream, leaving the shreds of his empire to selfish and rapacious generals. But this thought did not die with him. He had founded Alexandria, where Oriental philosophy, Judaism, and Hellenism were to be fused in the crucible of Egyptian esotericism until the time might be ripe for the resurrection word of the Christ. In proportion as Apollo and Minerva, the twin constellations of Greece, paled away on the horizon, the people saw a menacing sign, the Roman she-wolf, rise in the troubled sky. What is the origin of Rome? The conspiracy of a greedy oligarchy in the name of brute force, the oppression of the human intellect, of religion, science, and art by deified political power. In other words, the contrary of truth, by which a government receives its justification according to the supreme principles of science, justice, and economy. The whole of Roman history is merely the consequence of the iniquitous pact by which the conscript fathers declared war first against Italy and afterwards against the whole Roman race. They chose a fitting symbol for the brazen she-wolf, with tawny hair erect and hyena's head turned in the direction of the capital, is the image of this government, the demon which will take possession of the Roman soul to the very end. In Greece, at least, the sanctuaries of Delphi and Eleusis were long respected. At Rome, from the very outset, science and art were rejected. The attempt of the sage Numa and the Etruscan initiate failed before the suspicious ambition of the conscript fathers. He brought with him the Syllabine books, which contained part of the science of Hermes, appointed magistrates elect by the people, distributed territory, and submitted the right of declaring war to the official priests. Accordingly, King Numa, long cherished in the memory of the people who regarded him as inspired by divine genius, seems to be a historical intervention of sacred science in the government. He does not represent the genius of Rome, but rather that of the Etruscan initiation, which followed the same principles as the school of Memphis and Delphi. After Numa, the Roman Senate burnt the Sibylline books, ruined the authority of the Flamens, destroyed arbitral institutions, and returned to its old systems in which religion was nothing more than an instrument of public domination. Rome became the Hydra, which engulfed the peoples and their gods with them. The nations of the earth were gradually reduced to subjection and pillage. The Mamertine prison became filled with kings from north and south. Rome, bent on having no other kings than slaves and charlatans, destroys the final possessors of esoteric tradition in Gaul, Egypt, Judea, and Persia. She pretends to worship the gods, but the only object of her adoration is the she-wolf. And now, away on the blood-stained dawn, there appears the final offspring of this ravenous creature, the embodiment of the genius of Rome, Caesar. Rome has conquered all the nations of the earth. Caesar, her incarnation, arrogates himself to universal power. He aspires not merely to become the ruler of mankind, for, uniting the tiara with the diadem, he causes himself to be proclaimed chief pontiff. After the battle of Thapsus, deification as a hero is voted him. After that of Munda, divine apotheosis is granted by the Senate. His statue is erected in the temple of Quirinus, and a college of officiating priests appointed, bearing his name. To crown all in irony and logic, this very Caesar, who defies himself, denies in the presence of the Senate the immortality of the soul. Would it be possible to proclaim more openly that there is no longer any other god than Caesar? Under the Caesars, Rome, inheritor of Babylon, extends her power over the whole world. What has become of the Roman state? It is engaged in destroying all collective life outside of governors and tax collectors in the provinces. Conquering Rome feeds like a vampire on the corpse of a worn-out system. And now the Roman orgies are freely and publicly paraded with all their bacchanalia of vice and crime. They begin with the voluptuous meeting of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and will be brought to an end with the debaucheries of Messalina and the mad frenzy of Nero. They signalize their presence by a lascivious and public parody of the mysteries, and are destined to close in the Roman circus, where the nude virgins, martyrs to their faith, are torn to pieces and devoured by savage beasts amid the plaudits of thousands of spectators. And yet, among the nations conquered by Rome, there was one which called itself the people of God, whose genius was the very opposite to that of Rome. How comes it that Israel, worn out by intestine strife, crushed by 3 centuries of slavery, had preserved its indomitable faith? Why did this conquered people rise, prophet-like, to oppose Greek decadence and Roman orgies? Whence did they derive the courage to predict the fall of the masters who had their feet on the throat of the nation, and speak of some vague final triumph when they themselves were drawing to an irremediable ruin? The reason was that a great idea, inspired by Moses, lived in the nation. Under Joshua, the 12 tribes had erected the commemorative pillar with the inscription, "This is a testimony between us that Jehovah is God alone." The lawmaker of Israel had made monotheism the cornerstone of his science and social law, as well as of a universal religious idea. He had the genius to understand that on the triumph of this idea, the future of mankind would depend. To preserve it, he had written a hieroglyphic book, constructed a golden ark, and raised up a people from the nomad dust of the wilderness. On these witnesses of the spiritualistic idea, Moses brought down the lightning flash and the thunderbolt from heaven. Against them conspired not only the Moabites, the Philistines, the Amalekites, and the tribes of Palestine, but even the frailties and the passions of the Jewish people itself. The book ceased to be understood by the priesthood. The ark was captured by the enemies. Numerous were the times when the people almost forgot their mission. Why then, in spite of all, did they remain faithful to this mission? Why had the idea of Moses remained graven on the brow and heart of Israel in letters of fire? To whom is due the exclusive perseverance, this magnificent fidelity amid the vicissitudes of a troubled history, such a fidelity as gave Israel unique character among nations? It may boldly be attributed to the prophets and the institution of prophecy. By oral tradition, it may be traced back to Moses. The Hebrew people has the Navi at all periods of its history, right to its dispersion. But the institution of prophecy appears first, under an organic form at the time of Samuel. He it was who founded the confraternities of Nebiim, those schools of prophets in the face of a rising royalty and an already degenerate priesthood. He made them austere guardians of the Esoteric tradition and the universal religious thought of Moses against the kings in whom the political idea and national aim was to predominate. In these confraternities were the preserved, the relics of the science of Moses, the sacred music, the occult art of healing, and finally, the art of divination, exercised by the great prophets with masterly force and abnegation. Divination has existed under the most diverse forms among all the peoples of the ancient cycle, but prophecy in Israel possesses an amplitude, a loftiness, and authority belonging to the intellectual and spiritual nature in which monotheism keeps the human soul. The prophecy offered by the theologians, literally, as the direct communication of a personal God, denied by naturalistic philosophy as pure superstition, is in reality nothing but the superior manifestation of the universal law of the Spirit. The general truths which govern the world, says Ewald in his fine work on the prophets. In other terms, the thoughts of God are immutable and incapable of attack, quite independent of the fluctuations of things or of the will of action of men. Man is originally intended to participate in them and translate them freely into acts. But for the word of the Spirit to enter into carnal man, he must be fundamentally influenced by the great commotion of history. The eternal truth springs forth like a flash of light. This is why we so often read in the Old Testament that Jehovah is a living God. When man listens to the divine call, a new life is created in him. Now he no longer feels himself alone, but in communion with God and all truth, ready to proceed eternally from one verity to another. In this new life, his thought becomes one with the universal will. He possesses a clear grasp of the present and entire faith in the final success of the divine idea. The man who experiences this is a prophet, i.e., he feels himself irresistibly impelled to manifest himself before others as a representative of God. His thought becomes vision, and this superior might which forces the truth from his soul at times with heartbreaking anguish constitutes the prophetic element. The prophetic manifestations throughout history have been the thunderbolts and lightning flashes of truth. From the spring, those giants, Elijah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, drew their might. Deep in their caves or in the palaces of the kings, they were indeed sentinels of Jehovah, and, as Elisha said to her master Elijah, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen thereof. Often do they foretell with prophetic vision the death of kings, the fall of kingdoms, and the punishments to be visited on Israel. At times they are mistaken. The prophetic torch, though lit by the sun of divine truth, will vacillate and darken in the hands under the influence of national passion. But never do they waver concerning moral truths, the real mission of Israel, the final triumph of justice to mankind. As true initiates, they preach their scorn of outer worship, the abolition of sacrifices of blood, the purification of the soul, and the practice of love. It is with regard to the final triumph of monotheism, its liberating and peace-bringing role to all nations, that their vision is truly remarkable. The most frightful misfortunes that can strike a nation, foreign invasion, captivity in Babylon, cannot shake their faith. Listen to what Isaiah said during the invasion of Sennacherib. Rejoice ye with Jerusalem, and be glad with her. All ye that love her, rejoice for joy with her. All ye that mourn for her, that ye may be suck and satisfied with the breasts of her consolations, that ye may milk out and be delighted with the abundance of her glory. For thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the glory of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. Then shall ye suck, ye shall be borne upon her sides, and be dandled upon her knees, as one whom his mother comforteth. So will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem. And when ye see this, your heart shall rejoice, and your bones shall flourish like an herb. And the hand of the Lord shall be known towards his servants, and his indignation toward his enemies. For behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh, the abomination and the mouse shall be consumed together, saith the Lord. For I know their works and their thoughts. It shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. It is only before the tomb of Christ that this vision begins to find realization, but who could deny its prophetic truth when thinking of the part Israel played in the history of mankind? No less firm than this faith in the future of Jerusalem, in its moral grandeur and religious universality, is the faith of the prophets in a Savior or a Messiah. They all speak of him. The incomparable Isaiah is still the one whose vision is clearest, and who depicts it with the greatest force in bold, lofty language. There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And shall I make him of a quick understanding in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. But with the righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. and he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. Before this vision, the gloomy soul of the prophet becomes calm and clear, as does the tempest-troubled sky after a storm. For now it is indeed the image of the Galilean which is present before his inner vision. For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. For 8 centuries, the thunder words of the prophets caused the idea and image of the Messiah to hover above all national dissensions and misfortunes, at times under the form of a terrible avenger, and again as an angel of mercy. The messianic idea, tenderly nurtured under Assyrian despotism, in Babylonian exile, and brought to light under Persian domination, continued to grow under the reign of the Seleucids and the Maccabees. When the Roman rule and the reign of Herod came, the Messiah was alive in the consciousness of all. The great prophets had seen him as a great man, a martyr, a veritable son of God. The people, faithful to Judaic idea, imagined him as a David, a Solomon, or a new Maccabeus. Whatever he might be, this restorer of Israel's greatness was believed in and expected by all. Such is the might of a prophetic action. Thus we see that just as Roman history ends in Caesar, along the instinctive path and infernal logic of destiny, so the history of Israel leads freely to the Christ along the conscious path and the divine logic of providence, manifested in its visible representatives, the prophets. Evil is fatally condemned to contradict and destroy itself, for it is false, but good, in spite of all obstacles, engenders light and harmony after the lapse of time, for it is the fruit of truth. From her triumph, Rome obtained nothing but Caesarism. From her downfall, Israel gave birth to the Messiah. A vague expectancy hung over the nations. In the excess of its evil, all humanity had a presentiment of a Savior. For centuries, mythology had dreamt of a divine child. The temple spoke of him in mystery. Astrologists calculated his coming. Frenzied sibyls had loudly proclaimed the downfall of pagan gods. The initiates had announced that someday the world would be governed by one of their own, a son of God. The world was expecting a spiritual king, such a one as would be understood by the poor and the lowly. The great Aeschylus, son of a priest of Eleusis, was almost killed by the Athenians for daring to say that the crowded theater, by the mouth of his Prometheus, that the reign of Jupiter destiny would come to an end. 4 centuries later, under the shadow of the throne of Augustus, the genteel Virgil announces a new age and dreams of a marvelous child. Virgil Eclogue 4. The last great age, foretold by sacred rhymes, renews its finished course. Centurion times roll around again, and mighty years begun from their first orb in radiant circles run. The base degenerate iron offspring ends. A golden progeny from heaven descends. O chaste Lucina, speed the mother's pains, and haste the glorious birth. Thy own Apollo reigns. See, laboring nature calls thee to sustain the nodding frame of heaven and earth and main. See to their base restored, earth seas and air, and joyful ages from behind in crowding the ranks appear, to sing thy praise. Dryden. When will this child be born? From what divine world will this soul come? In what brilliant lightning flash of love will it descend to earth? By what wonderful purity and what superhuman energy will it remember the abandoned heaven? By what mightier effort will it return from the depth of its earthly consciousness, taking with it mankind in its train? No one could have told, but all were waiting and expecting. Herod the Great, Idumean usurper, the protege of Augustus Caesar, was then at the point of death in his Cyprian chateau at Jericho, after a sumptuous and blood-stained reign which had covered Judea with splendid palaces and human hecatombs. He was dying from a terrible malady, decomposition of the blood, hated by all, torn with fury and remorse, haunted by the specters of his innumerable victims, amongst whom were numbered his innocent wife, the noble Marian, the Maccabi blood, and 3 of his own sons. The 7 women of his harem had fled the presence of the royal phantom. His very bodyguard had abandoned him. Impassive by the side of the dying wretch sat his sister, Salome, his evil genius, the instigator of his foulest crimes. With diadem on brow and breast sparkling with precious stones, she kept watch, waiting for the king's last breath, when she, in her turn, would seize the reins of sovereignty. Thus died the last king of the Jews. At this very moment had just been born the future spiritual king of humanity, and the few initiates of Israel were silently preparing for his reign in profound humility and silence. Chapter 2. Mary, First Development of Jesus. Jehoshua, whom we call Jesus, from the Greek form of his name, was probably born in Nazareth. It was certainly in his abandoned corner of Galilee that his childhood was passed, and the first, the greatest of the Christian mysteries accomplished, the appearance of the soul of Christ. He was the son of Miriam, or Mary, wife of the carpenter Joseph, Galilean woman of noble origin, affiliated to the Essenes. Legend has woven a tissue of marvels around the birth of Jesus. If legend gives refuge to numerous superstitions, it also at times conceals psychic truths but little known, for they are above the perception of the mass of mankind. One fact may be learned from the legendary history of Mary, that Jesus was a child consecrated before his birth to a prophetic mission by the wish of his mother. The same thing is related of several heroes and prophets of the Old Testament. These sons thus dedicated to God were called Nazarenes. Touching this point, it is interesting to refer to the histories of Samson and of Samuel. An angel announces to Samson's mother that she will soon be with child and will give birth to a son whose head the razor shall not touch. In the case of Samuel, it is the mother who herself requests a child from God. Now Samuel, in its original root signification, means inner glory of God. The mother, feeling herself, as it were, illumined by the one she incarnated, considered him as the ethereal essence of the Lord. These passages are extremely important, as they introduce us to the esoteric, the constant and living tradition in Israel, and along this channel into the real signification of the Christian legend. Elkanah, the husband, is indeed the earthly father of Samuel in the flesh, but the eternal is heavenly Father in the spirit. The figurative language of Judaic monotheism here masks the doctrine of the pre-existence of the soul. The woman initiate appeals to a superior soul, demanding to receive it in her womb and bring to birth a prophet. This doctrine, considerably veiled by the Jews and completely absent from their official worship, formed part of the secret tradition of the initiates. It appears in the prophets. Jeremiah affirms it in the following terms: "The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." Jesus will say the same to the scandalized Pharisees. Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. How much of this can we apply in the case of Mary, the mother of Jesus? It appears that in the first Christian communities, Jesus had been regarded as a son of Mary and Joseph, since Matthew gives us the genealogical tree of Joseph to prove that Jesus can trace his descent from David. At a later date, legend, anxious to show the supernatural origin of the Christ, wove her web of gold and azure. The history of Joseph and Mary, the Annunciation, and even the infancy of Mary in the temple. An attempt to discover the esoteric signification of Jewish tradition and Christian legend would lead one to say that the action of providence, or the influx of spiritual world which cooperates in the birth of any man, whoever he be, is more powerful and evident at the birth of all men of genius, whose appearance can in no way be explained by the sole law of physical atavism. This influx reaches its greatest intensity in the case of one of those divine prophets destined to change the face of the world. The soul, chosen for a divine mission, comes from a divine world. It comes freely and consciously, but that it may enter upon an earthly life, a chosen vessel is needed, and the appeal of a highly gifted mother who, by the attitude of her moral being, the desire of her soul, and the purity of her life, has a presentiment, attracts and incarnates into her very blood and flesh the soul of the Redeemer, destined in the eyes of men to become a son of God. Such is the profound truth beneath the ancient idea of the Virgin Mother. The Hindu genius had already given expression to this idea in the legend of Krishna. The Gospels of Matthew and of Luke have rendered it with an even more admirable simplicity and poetic instinct. To the soul which comes from heaven, birth is a death. Empedocles had said 500 years B.C. However sublime the spirit be, once imprisoned in flesh, it temporarily loses the remembrance of all its past. Once engaged in a corporal life, the development of its earthly consciousness is subjected to the laws of the world in which it incarnates. It falls under the force of the elements. The higher its origin, the greater will be the effort to regain its dormant powers, its celestial innateness, and to become conscious of its mission. Profound and tender souls need silence and peace to spring into manifestation. Jesus passed his early years amid the calm of Galilee. His first impressions were gentle, austere, and serene. His birthplace resembled a corner of heaven, dropped on the side of a mountain. The village of Nazareth has changed but little with the flight of time. Its houses, rising in tiers under the rock, resembled, so travelers say, white cubes scattered about in a forest of pomegranate, vine, and fig trees, while myriads of doves filled the heavens. Around this nest of verdant freshness floats the pure mountain air, while on the heights may be seen the open, clear horizon of Galilee. To this imposing background, the quiet, solemn home life of a pious, patriarchal family. The strength of Jewish education lay always in the unity of law and faith, as well as in the powerful organization of the family dominated by the national and religious idea. The paternal home was a kind of temple for the child. Instead of the grinning frescoes, the nymphs and fawns which adorned the atrium of the Greek houses, such as could be seen at Sepphoris and Tiberias, there could be found in Jewish houses only passages from the laws and the prophets, the stern, rigid text standing out in Chaldean characters above the doors upon the walls. But the union of father and mother and mutual love of their children illumined and warmed the house with a distinctly spiritual life. It was there Jesus received his early instruction and first became acquainted with the scriptures under the teaching of his parents. From his earliest childhood, the long, strange destiny of the people of God appeared before him in the periodic feasts and holy days celebrated in family life by reading, song, and prayer. At the Feast of Tabernacles, a shed made of myrtle and olive branches was erected in the court or on the roof of the house in memory of the nomad patriarchs of bygone ages. The 7-branched candlestick was lit, and there were produced the rolls of papyrus from which the secret history was read aloud. To the child's mind, the eternal was present, not merely in the starry sky, but even in this candlestick, the reflex of his glory, in the speech of the Father, and the silent love of the Mother. Thus Jesus was made acquainted with the great days in Israel's history, days of joy and sorrow, of triumph and exile, of numberless afflictions and eternal hope. The Father gave no reply to the child's eager and direct questions, but the Mother, raising those dreamy eyes from beneath their long dark lashes, and catching her son's questioning look, said to him, "The word of God lives in his prophets alone. Some day the wise Essenes, solitary wanderers by Mount Carmel and the Dead Sea, will give thee an answer." We may also imagine the child Jesus among his young companions, exercising over them the strange prestige given by a precocious intelligence joined to his active sympathy and the feeling of justice. We follow him to the synagogue, where he heard the scribes and Pharisees discuss together, and where he himself was to exercise his dialectical powers. We see him quickly repelled by the arid teaching of these doctors of the law, who tortured the letter to such an extent as to do away with the spirit. And again, we see him brought into contact with pagan life as he visited the wealthy Sepphoris, capital of Galilee, residence of Antipas, guarded by Herod's mercenaries, Gauls, Thracians, and barbarians of every kind. In one of those frequent journeys to visit Jewish families, he might well have pushed on to a Phoenician town, one of those veritable hives of human beings swarming with life by the seaside. He would see from afar the low temples, with their thick, sturdy columns surrounded with dark groves, whence issued the songs of the priestess of Astarte, to the doleful accompaniment of the flute. Their voluptuous shrieks, piercing as a cry of pain, would awaken in his heart a deep groan of anguish and pity. Then Mary's son returned to his beloved mountains with a feeling of deliverance. He mounted the steps of Nazareth, gazing around on the vast horizon towards Galilee and Samaria, and casting lingering eyes on Carmel, Gilboa, Tabor, and Sychem, old standing witnesses of the patriarchs and the prophets. However powerful might have been the impressions of the outer world on the soul of Jesus, they all grew pale before the sovereign and inexpressible truth in his inner world. This truth was expanding in the depths of his nature like some lovely flower emerging from a dark pool. It resembled a growing light which appeared to him when alone in silent meditation. At such times men and things, whether near or far away, appeared as though transparent in their essence. He read thoughts and saw souls. Then in memory he caught glimpses, as though through a thin veil, of divinely beautiful and shining beings bending over him or assembled in adoration of a dazzling light. Wonderful visions came in his sleep, or interposed themselves between himself and reality by a veritable duplication of his consciousness. In these transports of rapture which carried him from zone to zone as though towards other skies, he at times felt himself attracted by a mighty dazzling light and then plunged into an incandescent sun. These ravishing experiences left behind in him a spring of the ineffable tenderness, a source of wonderful strength. How perfect was the reconciliation he felt with all beings, in what sublime harmony was he with the universe. But what was this mysterious light, though even more familiar and living than the other, which sprang forth from the depths of his nature, carrying him away to the most distant tracts of space, and yet uniting him by secret vibrations with all souls? Was it not the source of souls and worlds? He named it his Father in heaven. This primitive feeling of unity with God in the light of love is the first, the great revelation of Jesus. An inner voice told him to hide it deep in his heart. All the same, it was to give light to his whole life. It gave him an invincible feeling of certainty, made him at once gentle and indomitable, converted his thought into a diamond shield, and his speech into a sword of flame. Besides this, profoundly secret, mystical life was united with a perfect clearness on matters of everyday life. Luke shows him at the age of 12 years as increasing in strength, grace, and wisdom. The religious consciousness was in Jesus innate, absolutely independent of the outer world. His prophetic and messianic consciousness could only be awakened by outer circumstances, by the life of his age, in short, by special initiation and long inner elaboration. Traces of this are found in the Gospels and elsewhere. The first great shock came to him during a journey in Jerusalem with his parents, as related by Luke. This town, the pride of Israel, had become the center of Jewish aspirations. Its misfortunes had no other effect than to exalt the minds of men. Under the Seleucids and Maccabees, first by Pompey and finally by Herod, Jerusalem had been subjected to the most terrible of sieges. Blood had been shed in torrents. The Roman legions had butchered the people in its streets, and innumerable crucifixions had polluted the surrounding heights. After such horrors, the humiliation following on the Roman occupation, after decimating the Sanhedrim and reducing the pontiff to a mere trembling slave, Herod, as though in irony, had rebuilt the temple with more magnificent pomp and glory than ever. Jerusalem remained nonetheless the holy city, had not Isaiah, the favored author of Jesus, named it the bride before whom people shall bow down? He had said, "The Gentiles shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. Violence shall no more be heard in thy land, wasting nor destruction within thy borders. But thou shalt call thy walls salvation, and thy gates praise." To see Jerusalem and the temple of Jehovah was the dream of all Jews, especially since Judea had become a Roman province. They journeyed hither from Perea, Galilee, Alexandria, and Babylon. On the way, whether in the wilderness, under the waving palms, or near the wells, they cast longing eyes as they sang their psalms in the direction of the hill of Zion. A strange feeling of oppression must have come over the soul of Jesus when, on his first pilgrimage, he saw the city girt around with lofty walls, standing there on the mountain, like a gloomy fortress, the Roman amphitheater of Herod at its gates, the Antonia Tower dominating the temple, and Roman legions, lance in hand, keeping watch from the heights. He ascended the temple steps and admired the beauty of those marble porticos along which walked the Pharisees in sumptuous flowing garments. After crossing the Gentiles, he proceeded to the women's court, and mingling in the crowd of Israelites, drew near the Nicanor gate, the 3-cubit balustrade, behind which were to be seen priests in sacerdotal robes of purple and violet, shining with gold and precious stones, officiating there in front of the sanctuary, sacrificing bulls and goats, and sprinkling the blood over the people as they pronounced a blessing. All of this bore no resemblance to the temple of his dreams or the heaven in his heart. Then he descended again into the more populous quarters of the town, where he saw beggars, pallid with hunger, and whose faces were torn with anguish, a veritable reflection of the tortures and crucifixions accompanying the late wars. Leaving the city by one of the gates, he wandered among those stony valleys and gloomy ravines, forming the quarries, pools, and tombs of the kings, and converting Jerusalem into a veritable sepulchre. There he saw maniacs issue from the caves, shrieking out blasphemies against living and dead alike. Then, descending a broad flight of stones to the pool of Siloam, he saw stretched out at the water's brink lepers, paralytics, and wretches, covered with ulcers and sores in the most abject misery. An irresistible impulse compelled him to look deep into their eyes and drink in all their grief and pain. Some asked him for help. Others were gloomy and hopeless. Others again, with senses numbed, seemed to have done with suffering. But then how long had they been there to have come to such a state? Then Jesus said to himself, "Of what use are these priests, this temple, and these sacrifices, since they can afford no relief to such terrible suffering?" And of a sudden, like an overwhelming torrent, he felt pouring into his heart the grief and pains of this town and its inhabitants, of the whole of humanity. He understood now that a happiness he could not share with others was absolutely impossible. These looks of despair were never more to leave his memory. Human suffering, a sad-faced bride, would henceforth accompany him everywhere, whispering in his ear, "I will never leave thee more." His soul full of anguish, he left Jerusalem and proceeded towards the open peaks of Galilee. A cry leapt forth from the depths of his heart. Father in heaven, grant that I may know and heal and save. Chapter 3. The Essenes, John the Baptist, the Temptation. What he wished to know he could learn from none other than the Essenes. The Gospels have maintained perfect silence as to the deeds of Jesus previous to his meeting with John the Baptist, though whom, according to them, he in some way took possession of his ministry. Immediately afterwards, he makes his appearance in Galilee with a clearly defined doctrine, the assurance of a prophet, and the consciousness of the Messiah. But evidently this bold and premeditated debut was preceded by the long development of a veritable initiation. No less certain is it that this initiation must have taken place in the sole association in Israel, which at that time preserved the real traditions of the prophets and adopted their mode of living. There can be no doubt of this among those who have, rising above the superstition of literal interpretation, have the courage to discover how things are linked together by their spirit. This arises not merely from the intimate relations seen to exist between the doctrine of Jesus and that of the Essenes, but even from the very silence kept by the Christ and his disciples concerning this sect. Why does he who attacks with unparalleled courage all the religious sects of his day never mention the Essenes? And why do neither the apostles nor evangelists speak of them? Evidently because they considered the Essenes as belonging to themselves, as being linked with them by the oath of the mysteries and linked to the sect of the Christians. The order of the Essenes constituted in the time of Jesus the final remnant of those brothers of prophets organized by Samuel. The despotism of the rulers of Palestine, the jealousy of an ambitious and servile priesthood had forced them to take refuge in silence and solitude. They no longer struggled as did their predecessors, but contented themselves with preserving their traditions. They had two principal centers, one in Egypt, on the banks of Lake Maoris, the other in Palestine, at Engadi, near the Dead Sea. The name of the Essenes they had adopted came from the Syrian word aseia, physician, in Greek, therapeutes, for their only acknowledged ministry with regard to the public was that of healing disease, both physical and moral. They studied with great diligence, says Josephus, certain medical writings dealing with the occult virtues of plants and minerals. Some of them possessed the gift of prophecy, as Menahem, who had prophesied to Herod that he should reign. They serve God, said Philo, with great piety, not by offering victims, but by sanctifying the spirit. Avoiding towns, they devote themselves to the arts of peace. Not a single slave is to be found among them. They are all free and work for one another. The rules of the order were strict. In order to enter, a year's novitiate was necessary. If one had given sufficient proofs of temperance, he was admitted to the ablutions, though without entering into relations with the masters of the order. Tests extending over another 2 years were necessary before being received into the brotherhood. They swore by terrible oaths to observe the rules of the order and to betray none of its secrets. Then only did they participate in the common repasts, which were celebrated with great solemnity and constituted their inner worship of the Essenes. The garment they had worn during these repasts they looked upon as sacred, to be removed before resuming work. These fraternal love feasts, primitive form of the supper instituted by Jesus, began and ended by prayer. The first interpretation of the sacred books of Moses and the prophets was given here, but the explanation of the texts allowed 3 significations, just as there were 3 degrees of initiation. Very few attained to the highest degree. All this wonderfully resembles the organization of the Pythagoreans, but certainly it was almost the same among the ancient prophets, for it is to be found wherever initiation has existed. It must be added that the Essenes professed the essential dogma of the Orphic and Pythagorean doctrine, that of the pre-existence of the soul the consequence and reason of its immortality. The soul, they say, descending from the most subtle ether and attracted into the body by a certain natural charm, remains there as in a prison, freed from the bonds of the body, as from long servitude it joyfully takes its flight. Among the Essenes, the brothers properly so called lived under a community of property and in a condition of celibacy, cultivating the ground and, at times, educating the children of strangers. The married Essenes formed a class affiliated and under subjection to the other. Silent, gentle, and grave, they were to be met with here and there, cultivating the arts of peace. Carpenters, weavers, vine planters, or gardeners, never gunsmiths or merchants. Scattered in small groups about the whole of Palestine and in Egypt, even as far as Mount Horeb, they offered one another the most complete hospitality. Thus we see Jesus and his disciples journeying from town to town and from province to province, and always certain of finding shelter and lodging. The Essenes, said Josephus, were of an exemplary morality. They forced themselves to suppress passion and anger, always benevolent, peaceable, and trustworthy. Their word was more powerful than an oath, which, in ordinary life, they looked upon as superfluous and almost as perjury. They endured the most cruel of tortures with admirable steadfastness of soul and smiling countenance, rather than violate the slightest religious precept. Indifferent to the outward pomp of worship at Jerusalem, repelled by the harshness of the Sadducees and the prayers of the Pharisees, as well as by the pedantry of the synagogue, Jesus was attracted towards the Essenes by natural affinity. The premature death of Joseph set entirely free Mary's son, now grown into a man. His brothers could continue the father's trade and supply all the family needs, so Mary gave him permission to leave secretly for Engaddi. Welcome as a brother and one of the elect, he rapidly acquired over his very masters an invincible ascendancy by reason of his superior faculties, his ardent love, and an indescribable divine element manifested throughout his entire being. From the Essenes he received what they alone could give him, the esoteric tradition of the prophets, and by its means his own historical and religious tendency or trend. He came to understand how wide a gulf separated the official Jewish doctrine from the ancient wisdom of the initiates, the veritable mother of religions, though ever persecuted by Satan, i.e., by the spirit of evil, of egoism, hatred, and denial, allied with absolute political power and priestly imposture. He learned that Genesis, under the seal of its symbolism, concealed a theogony and cosmogony as far removed from their literal signification as is the profoundest truth of science from a child's fable. He contemplated the days of Elohim, or the eternal creation by emanation of the elements and the formation of the worlds, the origin of the floating souls, and the return to God by progressive existences or generations of Adam. He was struck with the grandeur of the thought of Moses, whose intention had been to prepare the religious unity of the nations by establishing the worship of the one God and incarnating this idea into people. Afterwards, he was instructed in the doctrine of divine word, already taught by Krishna in India, by the priests of Osiris, by Orpheus and Pythagoras in Greece, and known to the prophets under the name of the mysteries of the Son of Man and the Son of God. According to this doctrine, the highest manifestation of God is man, who, in constitution, forms organs, and intelligence is the image of the universal being whose faculties he possesses. In the earthly evolution of humanity, however, God is scattered, split up, and mutilated, so to speak, in the multiplicity of men and of human imperfections. In it he suffers, struggles, and tries to find himself. He is the Son of Man, the perfect man, the man type, the profoundest thought of God, remaining hidden in the infinite abyss of his desire and power. And yet, at certain epochs, when humanity is to be saved from some terrible gulf and set on a higher stand, A chosen one identifies himself with divinity, attracts it to himself by strength, wisdom, and love, and manifests it anew to men. Then divinity, by virtue and the breath of the Spirit, is completely present in him. The Son of Man becomes the Son of God, and his living Word. In other ages and among other nations there had already appeared sons of God, but since Moses nothing had arisen in Israel. All the prophets were expecting this Messiah. The seers even said that this time he would call himself Son of Woman, of the heavenly Isis, of the divine light which is the bride of God, for the light of love would shine in him above every other light with a dazzling splendor hitherto unknown on earth. All these secrets which the patriarch of the Essenes unfolded to the young Galilean on the solitary banks of the Dead Sea in lonely Engaddi seemed to him wonderful, but yet unknown. It was with no ordinary emotion that he heard the chief of the order comment on the words still to be read in the book of Enoch. From the beginning, the Son of Man was in the mystery. The Father kept him near his mighty presence and manifested him to his elect. But the king shall be afraid and shall prostrate themselves to the ground with terror when they shall see the Son of Woman seated on the throne of his glory. Then the elect shall summon all the forces of heaven, all the saints from on high in the power of God, and the cherubim, the seraphim, and the Ophanim, all the angels of might, all the angels of the Lord, i.e., of the elect and of the other might, serving on earth and above the waters, shall raise their voices. At these revelations, the words of the prophets, read and meditated upon times innumerable, appeared before the eyes of Nazarene with the profound and terrible light like lightning flashes in the night. Who could this elect be, and when would he appear before Israel? Jesus passed a series of years among the Essenes. He submitted to their discipline, studied with them the secrets of nature and the occult power of healing. To develop his spirit, he gained entire mastery over his body. Not a day passed without self-questioning and meditation on the destiny of humanity. That was a memorable night for the order of Essenes and the new adept, when he received in profoundest secrecy the superior initiation of the 4th degree, the one granted only in the special case of a prophetic mission, requested by the brother and confirmed by the elders. A meeting was held in a cave cut into the mountain and resembling a vast hall with an altar of stone seats. The chief of the order was there with a few elders, sometimes 2 or 3 initiates, prophetesses, also Essenes, were admitted to the mysterious ceremony. Bearing torches and branches of palm trees, they greeted the new initiate, who was clothed in a robe of white linen, as bridegroom and king, the one they had seen in vision, and whom they now looked upon perhaps for the last time. Then the chief of the order, generally an old centurion, Josephus states that the Essenes lived in advanced age, offered him the golden chalice as a symbol of the final initiation, containing the wine of the Lord's vineyard, symbol of divine inspiration. Some said that Moses and the 70 had drunk therefrom. Others trace it back from Abraham, who received from Melchizedek this very initiation under the elements of bread and wine. The elders never offered the cup to anyone in whom they had not recognized with distinct certainty the signs of a prophetic mission. But no one could define this mission. He was to find it himself. Such is the law of the initiates, nothing from without, everything from within. Henceforth he was free, master of his own actions, liberated from the order, a very hierophant, obedient to the impulses of the Spirit, which could fling him into the depths or transport him on high, far above the scenes of torture and human passion. When after the songs and prayers and sacramental words of the elder and Nazarene took the cup, a pale ray of the sun shooting through a rugged mountain crag ran in and about the torches and the flowing white garments of the Essene prophetesses. They too shuddered as they saw it fall on the Galilean's beautiful countenance, now overshadowed with a look of infinite sorrow. Were his thoughts dwelling on the poor wretches of Siloam? And had he already, in that ever-present anguish, caught a glimpse of the path he was to traverse? About this time, John the Baptist was preaching on the banks of the Jordan. He was not an Essene, but a prophet of the people, belonging to the sturdy race of Judah. Driven into the wilderness by a fierce, unyielding piety, he had there, in prayer, fasting, and mortification, lived a life of the strictest asceticism. Over his bare, sun-tanned skin, he wore a camel's hair cloak, symbol of the penitence he wished to impose both on himself and on his people. Deeply did he feel Israel's distress, and ardently did he await deliverance. According to the Jewish idea, he imagined the Messiah would soon come as an avenger and a judge, that like another Maccabeus, he would rouse the people to revolt, drive out the Romans, punish the guilty, and finally enter Jerusalem in triumph, where in peace and justice he would reestablish the kingdom of Israel over all nations. He announced to the multitudes who eagerly drank his words that the time was nigh for the coming of this Messiah, adding that they might prepare for it in a spirit of true repentance. Adopting the Essenian custom of ablution and transforming it, he had looked upon baptism in the Jordan as a visible symbol, a public accomplishment of the inner purification he insisted upon. This new ceremony, this earnest preaching to immense crowds of people, with the wilderness as a background and beside the sacred waters of the Jordan, near the rugged mountains of Perea and Judea, seized hold of the imagination and attracted multitudes. It recalled the glorious days of the prophets of old and gave the people what the temple could not give them, an inner shock, and, after the terrors of repentance had passed, a vague though mighty hope. They came from every part of Palestine and even from more distant lands to hear the desert saint who foretold the coming of the Messiah. The populace, attracted by his message, remained there in camps for weeks at a time, listening to him daily, unwilling to depart, awaiting the Messiah's coming. Many asked to take up arms under his command and to recommence the holy war. Herod, Antipas, and the priests of Jerusalem began uneasy at this excitement of the populace. The signs of the times, too, were ominous. Tiberius, at the age of 74, was rapidly hastening his death by scenes of debauchery at Capraea. Pontius Pilate was persecuting the Jews with redoubled fury, while in Egypt the priests had given forth that the phoenix was about to spring again to birth from her ashes. Jesus, who felt the prophetic calling even more emphatic within his soul, though as yet he was still feeling his way, came also to the desert of the Jordan, accompanied by a few Essene who already acknowledged him as master. He wished to see the Baptist, to listen to his message, and to be baptized in public. His desire was to present himself in an humble and respectful attitude toward the prophet who had the courage to denounce the present rulers and arouse from slumber the soul of Israel. He saw the rough ascete, hairy and bearded, with his prophetic lion-like head, standing in a wooden pulpit under a rustic tent covered with branches and goatskins. All around among the scanty desert shrubs was a mighty crowd, an entire camp, publicans, soldiers of Herod, Samaritans, Levites from Jerusalem, Idumeans with their flocks of sheep, even Arabs with their camels, tents, and caravans, arrested by the voice crying in the wilderness. And this voice of thunder passed over these multitudes. It said, "Repent ye, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." He called the Pharisees and scribes a race of vipers. He added that the axe was already laid unto the root of the trees, and said of the Messiah, "I baptize you with water only, but he shall baptize you with fire." Then, about sunset, he saw the crowds pressed towards a cove on the water's bank, and Herod's mercenaries bend their rough backs beneath the water poured over them by the Baptist. He drew nearer. John did not know Jesus, knew nothing whatever concerning him, but he recognized the Essene by his linen garment. He saw him, a mere unit in the crowd, enter the water up to the girdle, and humbly bend to receive the baptismal sprinkling. When the neophyte arose, the savage preacher's fiery eyes met the Galilean's calm, gentle gaze. A quiver ran through the man of the wilderness as he saw the look of wondrous sweetness beaming from the eyes of Jesus, and involuntarily the question escaped his lips, "Art thou the Messiah?" The mysterious Essene made no reply. But with bowed head and crossed hands, he awaited the blessing. John knew that the silence was the law of the Essene novices. After solemnly extending both hands, the Nazarene disappeared with his companions among the water reeds. The Baptist saw him depart with mingled feelings of doubt, secret joy, and profound sadness. What was his own knowledge, his own prophetic hope, compared with the light he had seen in the eyes of the unknown, a light which seemed to illuminate his whole being? Ah, if the handsome young Galilean were the Messiah, then indeed had the brightest day of his life dawned. But his own part would now be over, his own voice silent. From this day forward he preached in deeper and more emotional tones on the melancholy theme, "He must increase, and I must decrease." He was beginning to feel the gloom and weariness of an old lion tired of roaring, and now silently awaiting the end. Could it be that he were the Messiah? The Baptist's question also found an echo in the soul of Jesus. Ever since his consciousness had sprung to life, he had found God within himself, and the certainty of the kingdom of heaven in the radiant beauty of his visions. Then came the suffering of humanity, which had filled his heart with the awful outpour of its anguish. The wise Essenes had taught him the secret of religions and of mysteries. They had shown him the spiritual decadence of humanity and its expectation of a Savior. But how could he find the strength needed to rescue it from the pit? And now the direct call of John the Baptist fell on the silence of his meditations like a thunderbolt from Sinai. Could he be the Messiah? Jesus could answer this question only by inmost meditation. Hence, this retreat, this 40 days fast, narrated by Matthew in the form of a symbolic legend. The temptation in reality represents in the life of Jesus this great crisis, this sovereign vision of truth which all prophets, all religious initiates must infallibly experience before the beginning of their work. Over, above Engaddi, where the Essenes cultivated sesame and the vine, a steep footpath led to a cave or grotto opening out to the mountainside. It was entered by way of Dorian columns cut into the rough rock similar to those of the Apostles' retreat in the valley of Jehoshaphat. There one remained suspended above the yawning precipice as though from an eagle's nest. Below, in a gorge, could be seen the vineyards and human dwellings away in the distance, the Dead Sea motionless and gray, and the lonely mountains of Moab. The Essenes had appointed this retreat for such among them as wished to submit to the test of solitude. In this spot were several rolls of the prophets, strengthening their spices, dry figs, and a small stream of trickling water, sole nourishment of the ascete in meditation. It was to this cave that Jesus retired. First of all, he mentally reviewed the whole of humanity's past life and estimated the gravity of the present times. Rome was in sovereign power, and with what her Persian magi called the reign of Arimanes, and the prophets the reign of Satan, the sign of the beast, the apotheosis of evil. Darkness covered humanity, the soul of the earth. The people of Israel had received from Moses the royal and sacerdotal mission of representing the male religion of the Father of the pure Spirit, of teaching it to other nations and effecting its triumph. Had its kings and prophets fulfilled this mission? The prophets, who alone had been conscious of it, replied unanimously, no. Israel was in her last throes, crushed beneath the might of Rome. Ought a rising of the people to be hazarded once more, as the Pharisees still expected, a restoration by force of the temporal royalty of Israel? Should he declare himself son of David and exclaim with Isaiah, "In my wrath I will trample upon the people and overthrow their might"? Should he be a second Maccabeus and allow himself to be nominated Pontifex King? Jesus might have made the attempt, had he seen the crowds ready to rise at the voice of John the Baptist, and the strength he was himself conscious of was far greater than that of the prophet of the wilderness. But then, would violence overcome violence? Would the sword put an end to government by the sword? Would there not be thus supplied fresh recruits to the powers of darkness who were watching their prey in secret? Ought he not rather to place within the reach all of mankind this truth, which hitherto had remained the privilege of a few sanctuaries and initiates, to open every heart to receive it until the time should be ripe for it to penetrate the mind by inner revelation and science, to preach the kingdom of heaven to the poor and lowly, substitute the reign of grace for that of the law, transform humanity from its very base by regeneration of souls? But to whom would victory belong? To Satan or to God, the spirit of evil who reigns with the formidable powers of earth, or to the divine spirit who is enthroned above the invisible regions of heaven and sleeps at the heart of man just as the spark lies hidden in the flint? What would be the fate of the prophet who should dare to tear away the veil from the temple and lay bare the emptiness of the sanctuary, braving at once Herod and Caesar? And yet it must be done. The inner voice did not say to him as it did to Isaiah, "Take a large volume and write therein with a man's pen." The voice of God cried out to him, "Rise and speak." The word of life must be found, the faith which removes mountains, the strength which shatters the bulwarks of evil. Jesus began fervently to pray. Then a feeling of uneasiness and increasing trouble came over his soul. He had a feeling that he was losing the marvelous felicity he had participated in, and that he was sinking into a very pit of darkness. A black, dense mist came over him, peopled with phantoms of every kind. He recognized his brothers, his Essene masters, his mother. One after the other they said to him, "It is madness for you to wish for what can never be. You know not what is before you. Renounce it all." The invincible inner voice replied, "I must go on." Thus he struggled for a series of days and nights, at times standing, then again on his knees or prostrate on the ground. The abyss in which he was sinking became deeper and thicker and thicker, the enveloping mist. He felt as though he were approaching something inexpressibly terrible. Finally, he entered that state of lucid ecstasy in which the very depth of consciousness awakens, enters into communication with the living spirit of things, and projects in dreams the images of past and future. His eyes close, and the outer world disappears. The seer contemplates truth in the light which floods his whole being and converts his intelligence into a burning furnace. Then came the clash of thunder, the mountain shook to its foundations. A whirlwind, coming from distant space, carried off the seer to the top of the temple at Jerusalem. Down below shone roofs and minarets like a forest of gold and silver. Hymns were ascending from the Holy of Holies. Waves of incense arose from every altar and formed in eddying circles beneath his feet. People in festive garb filled the porticos, while women joyfully sang into the air their hymns of ardent devotion. Trumpets sounded, and a mighty chorus of voices exclaimed, "Glory to the Messiah, the King of Israel. Thou shalt be this king if thou wilt worship me," said a voice from below. "Who art thou?" asked Jesus. The wind carried him through space to the summit of a mountain. At his feet lay, in their golden glory, all the kingdoms of the earth. "I am the King of spirits and the Prince of the earth," answered the voice from below. "I know who thou art," said Jesus. "Thy forms are innumerable. Thy name is Satan. Appear in thy earthly form." The figure of a crowned monarch appeared, enthroned in the clouds. Around his imperial head shone a faint, pale halo. The somber figure stood out against a blood-red nimbus, with its pallid, ghastly countenance and eyes flashing forth a cold, steely light. He said, "I am Caesar. Only bow down before me, and I will give thee all these kingdoms." Jesus said to him, "Get thee behind me, tempter. It is written, Thou shalt worship only the Lord thy God." Immediately the vision faded away. Finding himself alone in the cave of Engaddi, Jesus said, "By what sign shall I overcome the powers of the earth?" "By the sign of the Son of Man," said a voice from above. "Show me this sign," said Jesus. Away on the horizon appeared a shining constellation, 4 stars in the sign of a cross. The Galilean recognized the sign of ancient initiations, familiar to Egypt and preserved by the Essenes. When the world was young, the sons of Japhet had worshipped it as the sign of earthly and heavenly fire, the sign of life with all its joys, of love with all its wonders. Later, the Egyptian initiates had seen it in the symbol of the great mystery, Trinity dominated by unity, the image of the sacrifice of the ineffable being who breaks himself in order to manifest himself in the universe. Symbol at once of life, death, and resurrection, it covered innumerable hypagia, temples, and tombs. The brilliant cross grew larger and came nearer, as though attracted by the heart of the seer. The 4 living stars shone forth like the sons of light and glory. "Behold, the magic sign of life and immortality," said the heavenly voice. "In ancient times it was the possession of men, now it is lost. Wilt thou restore it to them?" "I will," said Jesus. "Then look, behold thy destiny." Suddenly the 4 stars disappeared. It was night. Loud thunderclaps shook the mountains to the foundations, while from the depths of the Dead Sea emerged a dark, somber mountain surmounted with a black cross. On it was nailed a man in the agony of death. The mountain was covered with a demon-stricken mob, crying out in hellish jeers, "If thou art the Messiah, save thyself." The seer opened wide his eyes, then fell back, cold drops of perspiration streaming down his face, for this crucified man was himself. He had understood. In order to overcome, he must identify himself with this terror-stricken image, summoned up by himself and placed there before him like an evil boding omen. Wavering in his uncertainty as to the emptiness of infinite space, Jesus felt at once the tortures of the crucified one, the insults of men, the profound silence of heaven. "Thou canst take it or reject it," said the angelic voice. The vision of the cross phantom and the crucified victim began to grow dim, when of a sudden Jesus saw once more by his side the sick wretches of the pool of Siloam, and behind them myriads of despairing souls murmuring with clasped hands, "Without thee we are lost. Save us, thou who knowest how to love." Then the Galilean slowly arose, and with outstretched arms, in an attitude of supreme love, exclaimed, "Mine be the cross, let but the world be saved." Immediately Jesus felt a mighty rending asunder throughout his frame, and a terrible groan escaped his lips. At the same time, the dark, somber mountain and the cross faded away. A gentle, radiant beam of divine felicity entered the soul of the seer, and from the heights of heaven a voice descended, saying, "Satan is no longer master. Death is overthrown. Glory to the Son of Man. Glory to the Son of God." When Jesus awoke from this vision, nothing around him had changed. The rising sun cast his golden beams on the sides of the cave of Engadi. Soothing dewdrops, veritable tears of angelic love, bathed his bruised feet, and light clouds of mist were rising from the Red Sea. But he was no longer the same. A definite event had taken place in the fathomless depths of his consciousness. He had solved the problem of life and had won peace. The great certainty had entered his soul. From the rejection of his earthly being, which he had trodden underfoot and cast into the pit, a new consciousness had arisen in radiant majesty. He knew he had become the Messiah by an irrevocable act of his will. Soon after, he once more descended to the village of the Essenes, where he learned that John the Baptist had just been seized by Antipas and imprisoned in the fortress of Machaerus. Far from showing fear at this omen, he saw therein a sign that the time was ripe and that he in his turn must act. Accordingly, he gave out to the Essenes that he was about to preach in Galilee the gospel of the kingdom of heaven. That meant to bring the great mysteries within reach of the poor, and lowly to translate for them the doctrine of the initiates. Like boldness had never been seen since the days when Sakyamuni, the last Buddha, moved by the mighty compassion, had preached on the banks of the Ganges. The same sublime compassion for humanity animated Jesus. To it he joined inner illumination, capacity for loving, a grandeur of faith and energy of action belonging to himself alone. From the abyss of death which he had fathomed, and whose bitterness he had tasted beforehand, he brought both hope and life for all his brethren.